You know, this year's a little different because this is the Vogel lecture. Those of you who have come in the past know that it's typically in the spring. And you know that we always thank Ezra Vogel, as I will be in a moment. But tonight we're going to have to thank him twice. So the first time is as the donor of this endowed lecture series that is named for his parents. And by all accounts, they were just truly remarkable people. They had a, good segue, they had the People's Store. And, you know, created in the 20s, and then you have the Major Depression. The thing they were known for is that, you know, look, if you needed something for your family, they would extend credit. The other thing that made them remarkable people, I think, in addition to just their humanity, is that they really loved being in Delaware with Ohio Wesleyan University here. That town gown connection was very important to them. They enjoyed crossing Sandusky and coming to lectures, and it made for a meaningful enrichment of their lives, and then very much felt that that was something that was a really good relationship. So Ezra is an alum and grew up with those parents. He then, you know, normally if he's our speaker now, so I have to thank him. Let's stop, pause. Ezra, donor for the, yeah. So I have to catch myself though now, because now I'm going to thank him for being our speaker. But normally at this point, I would talk about how illustrious our speaker is, what an incredible profession he's had, all of his accomplishments, all of the books that he's written. But no, I can't do that. Because if you notice, the title of tonight's talk is From Delaware to Deng Xiaoping. And so Ezra, the child of these extraordinary parents, left Delaware, left Ohio Wesleyan, and became this internationally known expert on Deng Xiaoping. Delaware to China, to Deng Xiaoping. So Ezra, because my colleague, Ellen Arnold, has created this Sagan National Colloquium this year with the theme of, "Oh Woo, we need you." Oh Woo alums have gone out into the world and done great things. And so our alums are coming back. And so that's why Ezra is not only our donor for the lecture tonight, but our speaker for the lecture tonight. So you can't get more efficient than that. What do you think? All right, so Ezra, thank you very much for being our speaker. And as tempted as I am to say more about you, it would spoil the story.
Thank you so much. I can't tell you how happy I am to be here and to talk as a double lecturer, the Vogel lecture and the Sagan lecture. Sagan was a classmate of mine at Ohio Wesleyan, and he married Marge Pickett, who was also in our class. And in addition to Marge Pickett, she had a brother, Doug Pickett, and their father was a Methodist bishop in India. So John Sagan did a great job, and I think, as you know, he became treasurer of Ford Motor Company, got a Ph.D. in economics at Illinois, and they have a son, Scott Sagan, who I think has come back to the Ohio Wesleyan, who is a professor at Stanford and done a great thing on nuclear proliferation, and is a real great leader. So it's a special honor to be asked to talk about my time in Delaware and then to talk about my career. I wish I could do it without bragging, because I was taught to be a little more modest, but you'll forgive me if I occasionally get carried away. So the first half of my lecture is Delaware, growing up in Delaware and what it was like, and the second half is what I tried to do after I left Delaware. First of all, I want to acknowledge how much I appreciate the president of Ohio Wesleyan, Rock Jones, and what wonderful leadership he's provided for Ohio Wesleyan for 12 years, and how much I appreciate the faculty at Ohio Wesleyan, especially the history department, where the Vogel lectureship was placed, and Mark and Barbara and all the other faculty in the history department have been absolutely wonderful. Also, I'm so pleased in the audience that some special friends are here. One is cousins on my mother's side who are here, Jack Nachman and his sister Rachel and his wife. And so I'm so pleased that they were able to make it. And I'm so pleased that one of my professors at High Wesleyan, Russ Bailiff, his daughter is here tonight. And there are several people who I knew in Ohio Wesleyan before I retired. One is Harry Barrick, who was here tonight, who was teaching. I knew when he was here on the faculty. And one is Dick Smith and his wife, who were students in my days. Are there any other people here who were High Wesleyan when I was in the 50s? I ought to recognize. There aren't many of us left, but I think I speak for a lot of them who are still left, saying how much we love the place and how happy we are and how much we wish to carry the flag forward. Now, what I thought I'd start off with sort of giving my picture of Delaware and then tell our family's place in Delaware. When I was here, born in 1930, it was before the Depression, and we were here, of course, during the Depression. And I remember one of my classmates in first grade coming home and saying to me, my dad just got laid off today. And I went home and I said to Mom, what does laid off mean? Well, that was the Depression, and we could feel that. I remember during World War II, I'm not quite that old yet. During World War II, we sent a lot of soldiers off to the war, and some of them didn't come back. So I think one thing that our generation felt was the pain of the Depression and how much to work and how much we appreciated being able to live and have all the food we need to eat. And then after, there were a number of Delaware boys who went off, a lot of Delaware boys who went off to war. And you know, since in my days, 7th grade through 12th grade were all in the same building at Willis High, what we call Willis High in those days. And a lot of the older boys went off to serve in war, and a lot of people had little banners in their window for people in the service, and not all of them came back. So after the war, our generation really appreciated the fact that we could live decent, prosperous lives, and appreciated the sacrifices they made. And I think there was general recognition that we had to get along with other countries and the rest of the world in order to avoid war again. I think that was so clear to those of us here in town. I think it was also clear to a lot of national leaders. And I wish the leaders in Washington had that same sense of necessity of working with other countries that that generation had. And in Delaware, I think when Dad decided to come here in 1924, he felt that it would be a good place to raise. He wasn't married at the time. He had been divorced from his first wife, and he came as a bachelor here to Delaware. But he thought it would be a good place to raise kids because it was a college town, and they benefit from the college being there. At the time, not only was Delaware suffering from a depression, but I think that the town, as I recall, I used to spend a lot of time going through the 1930 World Atlas. As I remember, Delaware's population in 1930 was about 8,900. And now I gather it's around 40,000. So we were a small town, but it had grown around 1900 when the railroads came through. And the New York Central, you know, when they were constructing over there, there were quite a few workers who came in and on both sides of the railroad. Some of them were Irish Catholics, a lot of them settled on the east side of town. And Delaware had a little foundry over near the C&O Railway, and the C&O brought coal from West Virginia and through the industrial areas in Ohio. And so that brought a little prosperity, but I think the town was mainly what we would call a market town for farmers. And so they would come to town on Saturday night. They would come to town during the week. We thought in our people's store that where I worked with Dad, that rainy days were good for business because the people out, the farmers would come in out of the fields, they'd hop in their car and come to town, And so we were always busier on rainy days. And we were also busier on Saturday nights because about 5 or 6 o'clock on Saturday evenings, farmers would come to town and the streets were filled with people. It was like one festivity, it's like a fair, a weekly fair of people coming in from town, into town, meeting each other and being friendly. What I think was true of Delaware compared to a lot of towns is that the influence of the Methodist Church was a very strong and good one, because my mom belonged to the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is a group of Delaware women who were concerned about peace around the world. And because the Methodist Church sent people as missionaries, we had a little information from the missionaries coming in. And as I think back on how I got interested in China and Japan, I think maybe some of those missionaries planted the seed. There was a missionary in China named Bliss Wyant who had come back, and he played a very big role in music in Yanjing University in Beijing, and he played a role in passing the keys of the university to Beijing University when they opened in the early 1950s. And so he was kind of a link with China, and there were missionaries from Korea, and I think it was not only the sense that we had to learn to get along with those people, but also that we wanted to do good. There was a kind of a moral quality that I still admire and still feel comfortable with. I wish it extended throughout our country the way it did in Delaware, but I think that we really did have a wonderful kind of camaraderie. And my classmates in West School, in those days we had four schools, North, South, East, and West, and later they named them after some of the principals, like Boardman School and Congress School. And my graduating class at Willis, we had about 100 students, and several of them were from families that were deeply involved in Delaware. One of them was Leroy Hoffman, whose family was in Bun's Restaurant. One of my classmates was Jug Conger, whose dad was the principal of the East School. It's now still, I think, called Congress School. And so we had, one of them was Joe Dunlap, whose parents had the creamery. One of them was Dick Jackson, who unfortunately just moved away from Delaware to be with his kids in North Carolina because he felt they could take better care of him. And his parents were a salesman. His father was a salesman who was stationed in Delaware. So I think Delaware had the stores on Main Street were all busy and all filled. Years later, as things changed, the shopping areas around the edge of the town grew up big, and I think the shopping areas in Delaware really declined during that time. And over the years, I could see a lot of empty storefronts. But in my childhood in the 30s and 40s, the streets were full and the stores were full, and it was a bustling little town that had moral qualities and caring and links to the world through the fact that we had missionaries out there, and a lot of churches were collecting nickels and dimes to take to the people out there. Now, to come to my family and how they settled here, my dad was born in Poland, and when he was about 20, he felt that Poland was falling apart, and a lot of the young Jews there had to get recruited into the Tsar's army, and they didn't want to do that, and they could see that the place was a disaster. There was strong anti-Jewish feelings, and so at 1911, Dad left for New York, and there were so many Jewish kids. He describes going to one of his friends and saying, "I'm leaving for the United States next week," and the other guy says, "What day are you going?" He said, gave the date, and the guy says, "Okay, I'll go with you." and he got ready and came at the same time. And it was a flood of a lot of young Jews at that time who felt they didn't have a future, and they wanted to come to the United States. They'd worked in a garment factory in Poland, and so he started out as a cutter in a garment factory in New York, moved to Cleveland during World War I. Then he had an earlier marriage that ended in divorce, and he was thinking of leaving his home in Cleveland, and he thought it might be worth trying out a store and opening a store. And a lot of the little towns in the Midwest have stores that were owned by Jews. And I tell my friends, Jewish friends, that I think there were two Jewish institutions in those days. One was the temple, and we'd go there for the holidays. And then the second was the Merchants Annual Convention. Because when the storekeepers got together in Columbus every year and went to the jobbers and the wholesalers had their goods for sales, there were a lot of Jewish merchants that came to those. And so they had information about what goes on in the various little towns and various places. I used to say that there were so many Jews that a salesman who was a Christian had to at least be able to know Jewish jokes in order to survive in that convention. That was a part of the flavor of the place. So he asked around, and it turned out in 1924 there was this little store for sale in Delaware, Ohio. And from 1918, at the end of the war, that little store had been a surplus store for Army and Navy goods. It was called Sam's Army and Navy Store. But by 1924, most of those surplus goods, the shirts and the pants and the leggings and so forth, were mostly sold, and there wasn't much left. So that store was ready to go out of business, and Dad didn't have much money, and it wasn't easy to get a bank loan in those days. He had a friend who gave him a little help, and they were able to buy out the few goods that were left in that little store. And it was at 15 West William Street. And the building that was owned by Zach Davis, who planted seeds and would rent it out a little place. And so my dad was able to buy the store, and he came in 1924. Delaware at that time still had a Ku Klux Klan. And my dad, having experienced anti-Semitism in Europe, overestimated how much there would be here. There wasn't very much. But he felt very concerned, and he was, I think, always more nervous about it. Us kids who grew up here didn't experience it, and so we didn't feel it. But I think the people from the old country who had experienced it still had it in our minds that that was a worrisome thing. So he first made friends with some Catholics and Irish were his early friends. And he was very cautious. He didn't want to offend anybody. And he was smart enough to realize that to last a long time, and he wanted to really set roots here, he had to perform services and get along with people. Somebody at supper tonight asked me whether he was a Democrat. And the truth is, I can't answer it 100% because my parents never told me. I think Dad didn't even want his kids to know. My hunch is he leaned Democrat most of the time. He was for FDR, I'm quite sure. But he subscribed to the Ohio Republican News, and he was friends with Republicans, and he thought the job of a Jew is to get along with everybody. He didn't want to insult anybody. And to tell you the truth, he was not really very religious, even though he had been a Jew. There were a lot of Jews who came to New York around his time who were no longer as religious as some of the early generation, and he was of that generation. So he wasn't sure that he wanted to keep up his Judaism. And so he eventually, well, I'll get to that first. I'll get him married first. All right, so Dad came in 1924. He was a bachelor. He found one or two people who worked for him, and they had a little hole in the wall at 15 West William. And then in 1927, we go back and forth to Columbus, where we see some jobbers, some wholesalers who supplied the goods that he would sell in his store. And somehow a friend that he knew introduced him to a young woman and they hit it off, and within a year that they were married. That was my mother. And my mother's story is that she grew up not too far from Odessa, also Jewish, and her parents came to the United States about 1907, and she came as a much younger person with her parents. And she was the oldest of a bunch of, turned out 7 kids in the family by the time they grew up. And then not long after they settled in Columbus, her father died. And so she was in her high school age, had to drop out of high school to go to work, but she respected learning, and she liked the fact that Dad also is a merchant, but he kept books. And he had a big library at home, and he kept books of various kinds and kept reading, and was really interested in knowledge, even though he realized the way to earn money was as a businessman. Later on, when he was getting to the age when he was considering retirement, he really hoped that I would go in and be his successor. I think he was really ambivalent about it, because on the one hand, he wanted me to be his successor and see the store that he built continue, and he had ideas that we could set up stores in other towns, and if I wanted to, I could open up another store in some nearby town, and then we could build up a chain of several stores. And that was his idea of how to extend the business. I think a lot of business families have that idea. But I think he also respected scholars. He told the story that when he was a young kid, his mother looked at his hands and said, "We okay? Everybody can hear me?" Looked at his hands and said, "Oh, there's a working man's hands. You know, they aren't the scholar's hand." And she wanted him to be more of a scholar. And so I think he had a kind of ambivalent feeling. On the one hand, he was proud that he was a successful merchant, wanted to continue. On the other hand, he expressed he respected scholarship, and especially Mom respected scholarship too. And she felt the fact that she had to leave school in high school and that she had to go to work. It was a tough thing, and she wanted to give her kids a chance to study that she never had, and she thought becoming a scholar would be really just a great thing. Well, when Dad set up the store in 1924, he decided that if he was going to stay here a long time, he had to prove that he was an honest, reliable guy. One of our favorite stories, family stories, is that a man named Fred Hollenbaugh, who later became one of his best friends, and Morris Hollenbaugh, who was a Wesleyan graduate, later became a bishop in the Episcopal Church. Anyhow, Fred came into his store and asked Dad, "Do you have some interwoven socks?" And Dad said, "I'm sorry, we don't have interwoven socks, but we have something similar that I hope would be just as good for you." And the guy bought them and was happy. And then he came back and told Dad, he said, "Somebody down the street tried to sell me some socks that weren't interwoven." He said, "Those are interwoven socks." And they weren't. But Dad was honest and said, those aren't interwoven, but these are the best we can do. And so I think that was his determination to be honest. On the back of the sales slips, he had this slogan, "High quality, low prices." And the idea, he didn't like sales. He didn't think sales were a good thing. He thought the way to do a business was to do it right the first time. And as the business began to build up, he had the idea that he would buy big quantities, which you could get a little cheaper, and then sell just a tiny bit less than the other guy. So he could provide good quality at a little lower price than a lot of the other people who didn't buy in such big lots. So that meant in the store that he had a lot of goods stored in the basement, and then we had a lot of goods stored in the upstairs. And we'd climb upstairs many times during the day, and he would too, and downstairs where we kept the spare shoes. And we also, on the walls, those of you who go to that restaurant at 13 West William that was the Brown Jug and now is the Ale, I forgot the name of it.
Old Dog.
Old Dog, yes. Old Dog. That restaurant you can still see the very high ceilings. And in those days, there was a ladder that you could roll along the wall and reach up to very high shelves. So you stock a lot of goods, and you can get a little lower price. And he tells the story that one time a suit salesman came with a bunch of spare pants, suits, odd lots from suits. And Dad says, "I'll take 1,000 pair." And the guy couldn't believe what the hell is a businessman in a little town with a little teeny store buying 1,000 pair of suit pants. And Dad's idea was that they were high quality pants, and they didn't fit. He could sell them individually, but he could by buying that many, it would take a few years to sell them out, but he could sell them good quality at lower price. That was his idea of the way you did business. And he always thought that he did advertising, like in Delaware Gazette, like other people, but he always said the best advertising is a satisfied customer. And he loved customers. And one of the things we did, we went to church suppers in the surrounding towns, and Kilburn or Powell, in the days when Powell was a little town and not very rich, had church suppers, and other little towns around here. We'd always go to church suppers, and we loved them, and the people were happy to have them. And he also believed in supporting good causes. There was a guy named Harry Humes who was one of his favorite. And Harry tells the story that one time he went into Dad's store and said, "Joe, I'm sorry to bother you, but I have to collect money for the Boy Scouts. And I'm sorry, would you mind it?" And Dad said, "Harry, you got the wrong attitude." And he took him to the office back at the end of the store, and he lectured to Harry. He says, "Harry, you know, you're working for a good cause. You should be proud of what you're doing. And don't apologize." And gave him a big wad of money, more than he got from most other people. And that was Dad's attitude. I mean, some people thought he was a sucker because he would give to anybody who came in for charity at church or a local thing, he would give. Fortunately, he made enough money that he was able to do that. And when it got to the Depression, he was able to hand out goods to people who didn't need it. And he knew a lot of these people. And so they would come in and say, "Joe, you know, I'm sorry I lost my job. I don't have any shirt to wear. I need overcoat." And he didn't keep records. He said, "Okay." And he gave them, and they says, "When you're able to do it, pay me back." And so there was a lot of loyalty. And during the WPA days, the banks closed, I forget, like at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they didn't get paid till like 5 in the afternoon. And a lot of these people just lived hand to mouth, and they wanted the money as soon as they can. So on the days when they got paid, he went to the bank and took out a wad of money. So they come and cash the checks at his place while the bank was not open. And the girl at the cash register, Loretta Egger was her name. She was a Catholic girl. She had many years. She didn't ask their name, she knew them. So they would come in with a check and she'd cash it. And so a lot of people appreciated that. So I think they had a kind of a special feeling about Delaware. And they loved it and were loved in return. And as a kid, I thought working in the store was the biggest thing in the world. And so when I was, after the summer of my first grade, Dad let me come in an hour a day, and I could sweep the store. And then the next year, every year, it got up to 2 hours after second grade and 3 hours after the third grade. And my job was to sweep. And then I think by the time I was up to third grade, I could put the price tags on the clothes. We had a little machine that made price tags that I would stick onto the clothes, and I was allowed to do that. And then by another year or two, I was allowed to stock the sock department. Now that meant, every day at the end of the day, see which socks were sold, and then you run upstairs and get the replacement, so you fill up the bin where the socks go. And I was allowed to do that by the time I was 10 or 11. By the time I was 12, I was allowed to clerk. And to me, that was the greatest thing. I think that maybe I really felt the store was kind of special. I mean, he loved his customers, and he would say, he's a customer, you know. And when a customer would get sick, he'd go visit him, and you know, would say something about him. He's my customer. You know, they had almost a reverential quality to his belief and appreciation for the people he was customer. So that was kind of a special thing to grow up in that store. And then when I came to Ohio Wesleyan, I still worked in the store on Saturdays. And during Christmas vacation, I would always work in there because that was a very busy time, and we were there during the Christmas. Well, he started the store in 1924, married in 28. I was born in 30, and he kept the store until 62. And after he sold the store to Merrill Kaufman. Is Merrill Kaufman here tonight? He must be ill or something. He probably would be here. Yeah, he wanted to sell the store to somebody who appreciated it. And he didn't want to just make money because he believed in the service. And Merrill Kaufman came from a family, I think it was Washington Courthouse, that he grew up in a store that was somewhat like Dad's. And he was the second son. The first son took over the business in the family. And so Merrill didn't have really an opportunity in that place to prosper. And the first son took it over. It wasn't big enough for the both of them. And so Merrill Kaufman was the guy who was brought in to take over the People's Store. And Dad felt he kept up the same spirit of that store, and he did. So it was a wonderful kind of feeling. And to me, working in the store was always fun because Dad would take interest in people too. And how's your wife? And you know, what happened? You know, and so, and who sold which property? You know, down the street, and which new store opened, and all the little local things. He took an interest in all those. It wasn't a deep thing. I mean, he didn't often visit families. But it was a pleasant thing, and for the merchants. So, and I think there are a lot of other stores in Delaware where the people were thoroughly decent and nice, and it was kind of personal. You knew the customers and the owners of the store knew each other, and there was kind of a friendliness to the community, which in a larger community is hard to maintain. So, I loved that spirit, and that was part of my love of Delaware. And Ohio Wesleyan, I loved being here, and I knew a lot of the faculty kids in school. And I think Delaware schools profited. In those days, not many men were teachers in the high schools and elementary schools. And a number of the professors' wives were teachers. And I think they brought a high quality. I still remember, say, Mrs. Eisen, Don Eisen's wife, who was one of my favorite teachers in the high school. And there were many local girls at Ohio Wesleyan. And Brent Carson, who's here tonight, his mother was I think, wasn't she a Wesleyan graduate? Brent? Yeah.
Unfortunately, that was with
Ohio. But she was like an Ohio Wesleyan graduate in the same spirit. So we had a lot of good, dedicated teachers that we loved, and a lot of them were connected with Ohio Wesleyan. And my best friend, Dermot Southers, was the son of a professor, and we had a number of other professors' kids. And I think that sort of enhanced the quality of the elementary schools, high schools, and of the student body. Having a college town, I think, was really very good for it. And I felt that the teachers at Ohio Wesleyan were very dedicated. And so I'm glad to see Russ Bailiff's daughter here, one of my teachers there, and glad to see Harry Barrick here today. I know that Wesleyan has kept up that spirit because coming back for the Vogel lecture, I see a lot of people in the history department, and I think we have a wonderful history department. I think that they're all very dedicated, they're very bright, and they're just wonderfully, just the kind of scholars you'd want your kid to study under. So I'm very, very proud of them. Now, I've gone, maybe that's the end of the Vogel part of it, and now maybe I'll switch to after Wesleyan, then, well, there were a couple more things I want to add about Delaware. One of the people that I respected as a kid was a retired Bible professor named Ronald Walker. Now, Riley Walker at those time had a regular Bible column in some of the church literature. And when we, at school, selected our commencement speaker, we generally chose Riley Walker. And I remember one guy who wasn't a particularly good student, we were discussing who we should have as our next speaker, and he said, let's get that funny old man. And he didn't know much more about him, but he had a great sense of humor. And he used to talk about various things. And he would say, he said he would met Louis Westgate, and Westgate, another professor at Wesleyan, and said, you know, the dandelion is one of the most beautiful flowers there is. The other guy says, yeah, but maybe the common clover is even more beautiful. And that was a lecture on how to enjoy the ordinary thing you have in life. When he found out that I was interested in the scholarly career, he said to me, well, when you talk, when you write, you should always be clear enough so that it would tell it like a story so the children could understand, but make it profound enough so that the highbrow would be challenged. You challenge the highbrow, but you tell it in a way that even a kid could understand. And that stuck with me. I mean, that somehow, I admired that. And I wanted to write my books so that it didn't have jargon. And so I learned, as a graduate student, I learned a lot of jargon. And I tried to think it through. And I think some of that jargon is helpful as a learning device for college students. But I think for communicating, I always wanted to use plain English and tell it some of the things I tell are probably complicated enough so that maybe the ordinary 6th grade graduate wouldn't get it. But I at least wanted to be clear so that what I wrote would be accessible. So all the books I wrote, I always had in my mind what Riley Walker said. Try to have as your goal to write as clearly so the child can understand it, make it story-like, but have profound meaning in it. So that's been my goal in writing. Okay, I got drafted first before I went to graduate school. In 1951, I was drafted during the Korean War. And I went off, and the day I was drafted, Sherry Rowland's younger brother, Dick Rowland, was in the same group. And we went off to be drafted. And somehow I had taken enough psychology and sociology at Wesleyan that I was classified as a scientific and professional person. I could have gone to officers candidate school, but you have to stay in longer, and I didn't want to stay in longer than I had to. I wanted to do my duty and do 2 years. So we were, the highest rank I ever received was corporal, but I was classified as scientific and professional. And because I had enough psychology and sociology, I was classified as a psychiatric social work technician and given that position. It took a couple months training in Fort Sam Houston, Texas, and then assigned to the largest Army hospital for mental ill at the time, which was Valley Forge Army Hospital. So I spent my Army career, I was lucky I didn't have to go fight like there were people I took basic training with who were killed in Korea. But I was fortunate enough to go on and get trained. So I had the good fortune of working on the ward with a really great psychiatrist I was assigned. I was kind of a gopher for him. Did all kinds of little errands, but I got to walk next to him in rounds and see how he operated. And his name is Aaron Beck. He was very famous as a psychiatrist in cognitive psychiatry. And he was a wonderful teacher for me. So when I got through the Army, I decided that I had wanted to be a sociologist. And at the time, Harvard's Department of Social Relations was considered a hot place to go. And Hubert Bonner, who was one of the teachers here, said that's the place I should go, because they were trying to combine sociology and psychology in kind of a new creative way, and I thought that was great. And I wanted to do sociology and mental health. And there was a research project that a couple of professors had, and that I got onto that project. And I was able to earn a little money as a research assistant, and then write my thesis on the marital relationship of parents of emotionally disturbed children. That was my Ph.D. thesis. And it had nothing to do with Asia. I hadn't started to Asia. So then people say, how did you ever get interested in Asia? And especially you started so late. So I said, well, when I was halfway through my thesis, one of my thesis advisors' name was Florence Colloquium. She was an anthropologist, and she said to me, you're so provincial. You've never been out of the United States. How can you talk about American society if you don't have anything to compare it with? You ought to go abroad and see a different culture, and then you'll be able to have a better perspective on America. And so I said, where should I go? And she said, well, why don't you try Japan? Because Japan is a very different culture, and it's a modern country, so you'll be holding modernization relatively stable as a variable, and you'll be looking at a very different culture. So I talked to my wife at the time, and she thought it was a great idea. And I got a grant to go to Japan after my PhD. And it was first, the proposal was I work on mental health issues in Japan like I had in the United States. But while I was in Japan, I decided that there were some really interesting variations in different lifestyle in Japan. The first year I did nothing but language. It was full-time language study. And even though language was not good enough to really use professionally in lecturing the second year, I was able to interview families. And we saw the same families every week. So they got to know our limitations. And my wife went to the language school too. And so we could carry on conversations. And when we came back, our 3.5-year-old kid spoke Japanese, and we had a maid, a Japanese maid, and so we spoke Japanese at meal times, and our kids spoke Japanese and didn't know any English at that time. When he got to kindergarten, they teased him, and so he gave it up. He wouldn't talk. It was a sad thing. But anyhow, when he came back, so my first job was in Yale psychiatry department, and I was to bring social science to these people in mental health. And that was what I'd studied as a graduate student. But by Thanksgiving, I was thinking, I'm really more interested in Japan and a different culture and teaching about that than I was in the mental health field. So I went up to see one of my teachers at Harvard, and I said, you know, I really want to do mental health field, I don't want to do the mental health field. I really want to do Japan. And I've been offered a job at Columbia to work on Japan. I think I'll take it. And he said, how would you like to do China? I said, I never thought about it. Why? He said, well, there's a very interesting stage in our national history. He said, until now, the McCarthy period has been very strong. And people are afraid to talk, to teach about modern Red China because they might be in trouble. And foundations have been afraid to give any of the field. And now the McCarthy period is just coming to an end. And we want to have more. China is going to be important someday. And we ought to know more about it. It hasn't opened up yet, but someday it will. It's a big country. At that time, it had about 800 million people. And it's going to be a powerhouse in the world. And Americans don't know anything about it. And we got to get ready for that. And so a group of professors at various universities were meeting, and they decided, well, the way to do it is put it in the mainstream. Don't have it as a ghetto for East Asian languages. Get an economist who teaches economics and China. And get a sociologist who does China and sociology. and a political scientist, and an anthropologist. So each department in a really large major university should have a specialist on China. And there are no faculty that Harvard wants to hire in those fields now in the country because nobody's been trained. And so what we've decided to do at Harvard is get some money to take some people who have a Ph.D. and give them a postdoc on China. And how would you like to do one of that? And I said, Columbia wants to know right away, and I have to let them know, so I don't think I can. He called up the other faculty working on China, and within 48 hours I was offered a postdoc on China, and I took it. And so it happened very fast. I'd never thought of working on China, but I knew that China and Japan were close. And by the way, I just finished now writing a book called China and Japan Facing History, because since I ended up working on both countries, I'm one of the sociologists, few people in sociology who worked on both. So here I was now at Harvard on a postdoc, and 2 years at Harvard, and in the third year, we couldn't go to China yet because we didn't have relations. They didn't let Americans in to study. This was 1961 when I started on that postdoc, and it was ending in 64. And it wasn't until 71 that Nixon and Kissinger arranged for Kissinger to go to China, and Nixon went in 72. But here it was almost a decade before, and we were trying to learn about this country. And the place to learn about it was Hong Kong, so I spent a year in Hong Kong, and then I came back. And most people complain they don't rise fast enough, that they don't climb up the hierarchy quick enough. My problem was I rose too quickly. I mean, I was happy. After the end of that 3 years in 64, I was named a lecturer, and 3 years later I got tenure. But I knew I wasn't ready. And if you study Latin America or France, in college days, you already know a lot about the country. And as a graduate student, you take courses, and then you read books, and by the time you're teaching, you know a lot about it. And here I was, I had just started the language, and there were no courses anywhere in the country on Chinese society. And here I was getting ready to teach one. And I realized how little I knew, and I just had to keep at it. I became kind of a workaholic. I think when I lived in Delaware, I had more fun in life than I did. Well, I think Harvard, as a graduate student, the first year I was uptight because I'd never been to an Eastern college, and I knew they had a lot of smart kids. But then by the second and third year, I was okay. I was not quite so uptight. But I think I became most uptight as a young faculty member. And even when I got tenure, that somehow didn't do it. I mean, a lot of people feel once they get tenure, they can relax. But I knew a lot was expected of me. And that a lot of people knew a lot more about their countries than I knew about China. And that China was so big and so important, and Japan was big and important. And I was allowed to teach about both of them. I felt I had to work like a dog. So I became kind of a grind. And as my wife says, I'm a workaholic now. I think I became more of that under that pressure of rising rapidly. Well, I was a scholar, and so by 64, our eldest kid had trouble adjusting back in the United States after he had to give up his Japanese. So my wife says, we're not going to live a year abroad after 64. We had a year in Hong Kong. She said, after that, we're going to wait till he graduates high school before we spend a year abroad. So we waited until he graduated high school in 1975. I got a year sabbatical to go to Japan again. And it was kind of a restudy and catch up, and to think about the broader aspects of Japan, not just family, but to improve my knowledge of the economic structure and the politics, and get a broader picture of Japan. By the end of the year, I had been planning to write about the Japanese bureaucracy, and there were good books about the Japanese politics and about Japanese public opinion, society, but not on the bureaucracy. So that was my goal. But by the end of the year, I said, you know, I'm going to write an article that this country is really improving a lot, and we got a lot to learn from them. By the time I finished writing a draft of an article, I said, hey, I think I ought to write more about this. So I then thought about the number of things that Japan does well. And so in 1978, I was writing a book that was called Japan is Number One. And the reason I picked that title is because I didn't want to say, hey, Japan is number one. I didn't want to say that way. I said, look, the country's doing well. Just look at it. And I didn't want to come as a cheerleader. I just wanted to come as an observer. And so I tried to describe why Japan was doing so well. I said, look, they have a very long life. They have relative equality in society. They have a good educational system that's relatively equal. They have high standards of education. They have high standards of health. And they're doing a lot of things very well. So that was the essence of the book. Now, the reason the book got such attention, I think, is for the wrong reason. It was because Japan was doing well economically. And so a lot of people thought I was arguing that Japan was going to pass us economically. That was not the basic argument of the book, but I think it's why the book got the attention, to tell you the truth. So anyhow, that book got a lot of attention. In the United States, the people who made use of it, a few academics who liked Japan, but a few business people who could see, who knew enough about Japanese competitors that they wanted their employees to know, boy, Japan is coming up in autos, they're coming up in television, they're coming up in all kinds of sectors, and you guys really got to get to work. So they gave my book a lot of attention, and I went around speaking at different companies in the United States, and the book did pretty well in the United States in those sectors. But then it took off in Japan, and one of the Japanese newspapers had an article, The Vogel Plot, and the plot was that I would try to get Japanese to be overconfident to help out America so that America would become more competitive in Japan. But there were a lot of Japanese, in a way, there were a lot of Japanese who were beginning to realize that they were doing pretty well. They felt so far behind that here a Harvard professor says Japan is number one. And so they took a lot of pride, and the book became a bestseller in Japan. And I got a lot of attention for that. And so I was 49 years old. Until that time, I was not a well-known person. I thought of myself as a serious, honest academic who was doing his job and trying to be a good scholar. But then it sort of lifted to a different level, and I became more active in public affairs. And then a few years later, during the Carter administration, one of my Harvard colleagues, Joe Nye, was asked to be head of the National Intelligence Council. And the National Intelligence Council has about 11 people working on it as officers. They have about 5 or 6 geographical areas, and one of the geographical areas is East Asia. So he asked me to go down for a couple of years to be his East Asia person. So I was the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia from 93 to 95, a couple of years in Washington. And that was also a very good experience for me to really learn. And I wish I'd had that experience earlier, because I didn't have like people who sit back and read the papers, I had some idea, but living in Washington is different. And I really got a feel for Washington, I really got interested in that. So then when I got back to Harvard, I was already 65, and I decided that I wanted to retire at 70 and let younger people come in, and then I would do research. So I did that, and at 70 I retired. And then I decided, I felt kind of responsible. I think it's the kind of responsibility that a good Delaware kid who feels a responsibility in his field wants to do good for the country. And so I wanted, at that time, to help educate Americans about what was going on in China. And I felt, as a Harvard professor, already a little bit known that Japan is number one, that if I wrote a book about how China took the reform and opening, that could have a broader appeal. So I took Deng Xiaoping, who was the big leader of China, and he was the one who led that reform and opening. If I could do a good book about him, that should have a lot of interest. I had a lot of good luck because his daughter had sent her daughter to Wellesley, and I'd met the daughter at a meeting, between Chinese and Americans, and so I asked her whether she would talk to me or something, and she did. So I met her several times, and then I had been invited occasionally to give talks or take part in conferences in China. And one research center that I had given a talk at was led by a guy who had been a secretary to the #2 guy in China under Deng named Chun. And I asked him if he'd cooperate, and he said he would. So those two people had a lot of deep insight. And then in addition, one of the Harvard students had a grandfather who was the governor of Guangdong and the leader there that led reform. And he became a research assistant. And we went to Beijing, and he was able to set up lots of interviews because of his grandpa. So you can say I used pull. The Chinese have a word guanxi. You use connections. And so, yeah, I used connections, anything I could to get research. And so I was able to get, I think, of course I went through records and read stuff, but I was able to interview people who were involved in ways that most people couldn't. There's another stroke of luck I had, and I don't know how much, I ought to end pretty soon, right? Oh, well, one other by-way story. In the 1980s, I had the good fortune that Massachusetts and the southern province of Guangdong became sister provinces. And because I had worked on that province, Guangdong, I was allowed to help show around some of the leaders from Guangdong that came. I spoke enough Chinese I could communicate with them. I had studied their province. So when they came to Boston, I became quite friendly with them. So they decided, one of the guys in the government office, that what they wanted was foreign investment, and they had trouble getting enough foreign investors interested at that time. This is very early in reform. They thought if a Chinese wrote a story about what they're doing, nobody would believe it. But if a Harvard professor wrote a story about what was going on, it might be more helpful. So they invited me over to spend 6 months, and I said, look, I'm not going to give stories. I have to tell like I see it. And they said, okay, we think we're doing well enough. If we just tell the story, that'll be okay. So I had the good fortune of going to Guangdong and living in the provincial guest house and working under the Economic Commission of the province. And they sent me all over the province to see all the different counties and all the different localities and projects that I could write about in a book I called One Step Ahead in China, because it was the term that they used about themselves, 先行一步, one step ahead. And so that was the translation title that I used for the English title when I wrote about that. So that gave me, I think, a lot of understanding about what goes on at the local level that's not easy for scholars to get. So by the time I did the book on Deng, I really felt lucky that I was able to have a book that then became a bestseller in China, because a lot of Chinese felt that that things were so much more controlled in China, and that if I was able to describe a lot of things that they had not been told in their press, and I was able to put it in a story like Dr. Walker would have wanted me to, and to tell the story of how he went about leading China. So the book it did okay in the United States, and Harvard Press is happy, but it became especially successful in China. And I didn't want to be accused of telling that story to make money, and so I tried to decide what institution I would like to have the income from China, that China book go to. I said, Ohio Wesleyan. And so I dedicated Ohio Wesleyan. I'm so happy I did. And then after that book did well, I'm still a do-gooder, and I think that comes from, you know, even though I was a Jewish kid, I think the Methodist environment around here of doing good, I think got to me. And so I wanted, in 2010, when I finished Deng book, I felt China and Japan had such horrible relations. I worked in both countries, I love both countries, and I wanted them to get along better. And so I decided, Chinese were saying, Japanese don't know enough about history. So I decided, all right, I'll spend a few years learning about the history between the two countries. And so I spent the last 7 years writing about that history, learning about that history. I just have a new book called China and Japan, which just came out with Harvard Press. And it's going to be in Japanese, and I'll go to Japan in November to talk about it. And then I'm going to, it's already translated in Chinese, and will be published in Hong Kong. Even though Hong Kong has a lot of pressure from China, and you read about it in the paper every day, it's still possible to get things published in Hong Kong much more freely than the mainland. So the book is already coming out in Hong Kong next month. And then the censors in China will have to decide whether the book is possible to be published, and I don't know the answer to that. I hope they decide to do it in a way that I can accept and let out to be published, but I don't know. So here is some local kid who loved Delaware and still loves Delaware, who had a lot of good luck along the way, and I stuck at it, and I've had just wonderfully good luck. Not everybody has that much good luck and that great opportunities, but I'm so thankful to the people of Delaware and the university for giving me this chance, and I love coming back here. Thanks, Barbara.
Ellen's going to take over the Q&A, but I just wanted to say, wow. I mean, you know, the Delaware part was fascinating, and then he goes off to Japan, clearly a facility with language.
No, it's hard work.
I know, you're hardworking, you're a workaholic. You already told us that. But I'm saying,
I don't have special skill.
You know, when did you learn to speak Japanese, and when?
I started Japanese at age 28 and Chinese at 31. Yeah.
Thank you, Ezra, and such an amazing model of lifetime learning. Oh my goodness. And such a wonderful model for our students to realize that you can not only dream big, but be ready and be open for complete serendipity to hit your lives. And I'm going to be quiet now and open it up to you guys for questions. We've got time for a handful of questions.
Hi, my name is Maddie, and I was just curious if you were planning...
Are you a student?
I'm sorry?
Are you a student?
Yes, I'm a history major.
Good.
Thank you. I was just curious if you were planning to return to Japan or China in the near future.
I'm going to Hong Kong in early November, and I'll give some lectures there. And I'm going to Japan to talk about my new book. And I'm going there in November. And over the years, you know, I've had the good fortune of having a lot of good former students. And so I will see a lot of those former students. There's one more story I want to tell. Maybe this isn't an answer to your question, but it's tells about what joy it is to have such good students. In 1975, one of my Ph.D.s wanted to get a job at an East Coast university, and his name is Rick Dyke, D-Y-C-K. And he couldn't get a job on the East Coast, and he got a job at Ohio State. He went to Ohio State in, I think it was 1975 or 1976. When he was here, when he arrived, Ohio State had just lost out with Pennsylvania in attracting a Volkswagen plant. The governor of Ohio and the governor of Pennsylvania were both trying to get Volkswagen to set up a plant, and Pennsylvania won. So Rhodes, who was the governor, wanted to try to do something, and so he wondered whether any of the Japanese factories, at that time, there were no Japanese auto factories in the country. And so he went to Ohio State and asked any of the faculty there had any contact with Japan to give advice. And so my former student knew much more about contemporary Japan than any of the others. So he asked him to be Ohio State trade representative in Tokyo, sent him out there. And he went out right away. He retired from Ohio State, went out and became the state representative in Japan. Within 6 months, he had been starting conversations with this factory called Honda. You know the end of the story. He was the go-between in bringing Honda. And when Rhodes went to Japan, he was the go-between, introducing between Rhodes and Japan. And so he brought Honda to Marysville, and Honda wanted a lot.
Started calling it Honda.
Honda, yeah. Yes, okay, Honda. It's the American pronunciation. The word home means book in Japan. And then all the little subsidiaries that make parts, they wanted to set up their own factories. And he went with them one by one and took them. And he still played a major role for several years in getting Honda to get started in Marysville. And so I think I've done more to contribute to Central Ohio through that student than anything I wrote. So that's, I just feel very, his name was Dyke, D-Y-C-K. And he later helped set up a company, a semiconductor testing equipment named Teradyne, that he set up their Japan role and played a huge role in getting that. And he's still out there and studying and working. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Spencer. I'm a student and I'm a history major. I just wanted to ask, given that U.S. and Chinese relations are so tense, what you think can be done to ease tensions, and if you see a role for yourself to play in that easing?
I could go on all the rest of my time on that one. We're doing a lot of things. One is that we have a program for training China specialists, young faculty throughout the country. There's a national committee on U.S.-China relations. And we select every 3 years 20 of those people, and we take them on delegations to Washington and to Beijing. And so that when they get back to their local areas, they're able to provide leadership on U.S.-China relations. And we are now starting our 6th cohort. So we've been doing that for 15 years. I'm a senior advisor to that group. And I think all those people are playing a very important role. I give a lot of talks in the United States. I see a lot of visitors from China. And I do think the mood in Washington is poisonous. And I think it's not entirely accurate. It's not well informed. A lot of the people speaking out are people who feel the pressure, but who don't understand what's going on. I think there are a lot of things China has done wrong, and we ought to be critical of them. They have often stolen technology that they shouldn't. They have often been very tough on people trying to speak out. They have been too tight on allowing freedom of scholars to do their research, including American scholars. There are a lot of problems, but the fact is they're a strong country and we're going to have to live with them. So the main thing I'm doing right now, though, is I'm working with some professors at the Kennedy School at Harvard and some in the Chinese studies fields at Harvard. And we're going to try to come up with a report October 2020. The reason we picked that time is just before the election. And what we're going to do is try to come up with a report that's going to be not more than 20, 25 pages. And I'm going to try to follow Ronnie Walker's idea of making it clear and not using any jargon and making something accessible, even if the politicians don't take the time to read it, maybe their assistants will. And to try to set out what would be a good policy for the United States. A lot of us who work on these issues think that dropping out of the trade pact with Asia, TFF, was a wrong thing. And so we would try to come up with some suggestions for the future administration that takes office in January 2021. If Trump remains the president, we'll hope that he will follow them, or some people who work for him will follow them. And if a different administration, where we think more things would be possible, we hope they will follow it too. And our idea is, if this report comes out and does well, that it could be a guide for the new administration, and that we're ready to work with the new administration in trying to implement a new policy. Academics don't always get their way, and there are a lot of different views, but we think that that there's a good chance that this could be an important report, and that it could play a role in a helpful direction. You can't be sure, and there are a lot of unpredictable things, but if I try to think what's the most constructive thing that a bunch of scholars could do and hope to do to try to surpass that terrible mood in Washington that is in danger of making China a real enemy and in danger of having conflict, I think that's the most we can do. So I'm going to be spending a lot of time the next year working on that report. So that's the quick answer. Yeah. Yeah.
So hi, Professor Vogel. So as a Chinese immigrant living in Delaware, so...
Oh, you live in Delaware?
Yeah.
What kind of work do you do?
I'm a materials engineer.
Oh.
Yeah, but I'm interested, I'm your fan, so I bring your books here. So I read all your books, I watch all your interviews on the YouTube, whatever, and I bring my 6-year-old daughter here as well. So.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah, before I came to this lecture, I asked my friends in China what kind of questions you want me to ask Professor Vogel. So they gave me a lot of questions, I carefully select one of them. Since it's the right timing, I know it's a homecoming for you to Delaware. Probably it's not very appropriate to talk about China politics here. But
yes, it is.
Yeah, so but it's interesting timing because in a couple of hours, the current China leader will be inspecting a big military parade. That's the 70th anniversary of Chinese Communist, whatever. So because we want to hear from you, what's your current comment on him? Because a lot of Chinese overseas, including myself, we are worried in last few years since he came to power. We don't want to see this increased tensions between China and the US. And we know, I watched your interview in 2015 with VOA. Your comment was that he's more on the Deng Xiaoping side instead of Mao Zedong side. But I think a lot of Chinese, including myself, would probably think he was more close to the Mao Zedong side. Oh, that's what we are worrying for. And also the things happening in Hong Kong, if you think Deng Xiaoping is still alive, and is that what he wants to see and how he can solve this problem? Thank you so much.
The current leader, as you know, October 1st is a big national day in China. So we will be getting news the next several days about the huge military parade and about all the speeches and all the conversations. I think it'll fill the press the next few days. I think to understand him, first of all, he didn't have the experience working in Beijing that Deng did. And he, although he came from a family where his father held high positions and he has friends, his education was during the Cultural Revolution, so he didn't get the highest levels of education. And then his work experience for the party was in regions. So he worked in Fujian and he worked in the and Shanxi and such places. But he didn't have that much experience in Beijing. And I think what a lot of leaders in Beijing are afraid of is that when they think what happened to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, that it fell apart, and that it was in the process of loosening, that it lacked the capacity to hold things together and it fell apart at that time. So I think that it's not just Xi Jinping. I think there are a lot of leaders who are afraid that if they relax too much, if they don't remain there strong, that there will be too many demonstrations, and that the problem of China ever since the middle of the 19th century is that it was falling apart and it was too divided, and that it takes a certain amount of power to hold it together. So I think that's their mentality, and I think it's not just Xi Jinping. I think there are a lot of other leaders who agree with them. In my personal view, some of the ways they're going about it are not sustainable. The effort to control information is impossible. They're trying to control the information, the education, and they don't let certain people talk about certain ideas. But there are now 1.5 million Chinese students abroad. There are 350,000 Chinese students in the United States. Even if they don't go back there to live, they have relatives and they're back in touch. And there were almost 100 million Chinese who were tourists last year someplace in the world, 8 million in Japan alone. So how can you control information inside China the way you could do, say, in an earlier period where you didn't have access to the internet and you didn't have access to traffic? I think that's unsustainable. And I think sooner or later they're going to have to find a way to open up more. Some people in Washington now say that because China hasn't opened up, it shows that we were too optimistic. But I don't think we've seen the end of history. I think we see a stage now when there is effort to have that kind of tight control. But if you look, if you were alive, you're young, but if you were alive in 1966 or 1976, you might have said things are so tight, we can never open up. And then 2 years later, Deng came to power and they began to open up. So I'm probably too old. I may not see the days when China begins to have a more open policy. But I think the effort to control information as tightly as they're doing is unsustainable, and they will have to begin to open up. And I think that now in dealing with Hong Kong, there are people there who realize that they were a little too tight, and that made it, there's going to create a lot of opposition in Hong Kong. And I think that even though the Chinese now leaders are very ambitious for around the world, they want to set up economic aid, and they already have more trade with other countries than we do. And I think those in Washington who think that we can control China now underestimate where China is already. They have science and technology and military, and they have more trade with other countries. If you go to African countries and say, now we aren't going to like it if you sign up with the Chinese and the Chinese offer more money, they're going to take the money from China. And we have to learn to live with that. We have to develop a policy that's realistic and that takes account of where China is. So I'm not happy with everything that Xi Jinping is doing, but I think I understand where he's coming from and why he is so worried that as economic growth rate slows down, that he doesn't want the place to fall apart, and he's trying his best to hold it together in a very tight way. So.
Hi, I'm Lydia. I'm from Korea, and I'm a current student in the Ohio Wesleyan University with potential major in international studies, international relations. Are you
from Seoul or where?
I'm from Busan.
Busan, okay.
I'm just curious, what made you choose Deng Xiaoping for today's title, and is there a special reason that you study about Deng Xiaoping?
Well, those who don't know Busan, historically was the open port in the later part of the Li dynasty in Korea. And so it's a much more cosmopolitan international city than many places in Korea. The reason I chose Deng was because I thought it was a dramatic presentation of the reform and opening in China. And so in 2000, when I was thinking about what book to write to help Americans understand what was going on in China, I thought the most important trend was this new policy started in December 78 of opening and reform. I think that was the most important thing. And I felt that the way to describe that, again, to tell the story of the leader who led that. And I do think that Deng Xiaoping played an extraordinary role. My own view after, when I started on the book, studying for the book, I knew he was important. But by the end, I really became convinced, if you think in the 20th century, what leader did more to impact world history over the long term than any other leader? I think you could make a strong case that it's Deng. Because if you think back, you could say Stalin, but Soviet communism collapsed. And you might think Franklin Roosevelt, who did a tremendous amount during World War II, but after World War II, it didn't have that much impact on the developments later. But I think the program that Deng led in 1978 of opening up markets, taking markets that had been closed and turning around the policies from Mao without splitting the country, but of opening it up around the world and trying to form better relationships and of sending out people all over the world to learn, I think is just, the last 40 years in China are just remarkable. Not only is it the biggest population in the world, but growing 10% a year in a country of over 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion people, growing 10% a year for over 30 years, is staggering. And in 1978, when Deng visited Japan, he rode on their fast train, the Shinkansen. At that time, China had no fast trains. China now has roughly half the world's mileage of fast trains. When he went, the steel production in China was something like 25 million tons a year. Last year it passed 1 million tons, about as much steel as the rest of the world combined. Of course, it's a huge population, but still, to turn that country around that had been in the culture evolution and great leap forward, people starving just a few years before, to turn that around, to manage that politically, and to provide that leadership, I think it's really extraordinary. So, there are a lot of things I've done that I don't think will necessarily last, but I think that book on Deng will last a while. And just as my dad wanted customers to last, he didn't want to make the quick sale. He wanted to keep customers. So when I was thinking of writing a book, I don't care about how many it sells one year. I wanted to write a book in my later years that I thought would last, and I think it will. This is an immodest way to put it, but I don't think there's a better book on Deng. And some people have said that in any language, including Chinese, the reason it sells well in China is that Chinese have not been allowed to write that kind of comprehensive story. And that given all the access I was given, I think it really, I was very lucky and I played a major role. So I really think that, I was right in my decision. Yeah. Okay.
Dr. Vogel, you mentioned that you're concerned that Chinese might censor your newest book.
Yep.
How much did they censor your other books?
I think the book on, it's interesting, the book I did on middle-class families in Japan was not even printed in China until 2 years ago. And I said, why the hell are you printing now the book I wrote on Japan and published in 1963? And they said, well, a lot of people now entering the middle class in China, and they're interested in how other countries behaved when they first began entering the middle class. And so that was entirely new. Some of the books on Guangdong, they pretty much translated as they were. The books on Guangdong, 2 books, one, Canton Under Communism, and the other, One Step Ahead. The Guangdong press able to do it pretty much as they did. The book on Deng, we had a marvelous publisher, Sunlian, which is a very good press. And the editors there really wanted to make as much of what I said available to the Chinese public as possible. And the editor there became a friend of mine and is still a friend of mine. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One example, in the book, I said that in the Great Leap Forward, as many as 30 to 40 million people died from starvation. And he said, they won't allow that to be published. And I said, what can I do to let them know? He said, how about we say some foreign scholars have estimated 30, 40 million people died. And he got it through. He got it through his publisher. And another thing, the big complaint about Deng Xiaoping is he put down the June 4th, 1989 uprising of students, and there were a lot of people killed near Tiananmen Square during that time. And I think it was a horrible thing, and I think Deng was very unhappy to do it. In the book that I wrote in English, I said that Deng had decided to put it down. And they said, we can't put that down. And I said, well, how should we handle it? They said, how about we say the party decided to put it down? They didn't want to give the official thing to Deng. And the truth is, I didn't have proof that he made that decision. I just assumed that since he had that much power, that he had to have made that decision, or at least went with. So I said, okay, the party made the decision. But officially, that's true. The party did make that decision. And so that's the way we ended up publishing it. So I guess my bottom line is that there are a lot of different kind of people in China. And there are a lot of people who realize they want to have the truth and do as much as they can to get the truth. I just talked this week to a Chinese friend who is a specialist on North Korea, one of their best specialists on North Korea. And a lot of his ideas are different from the dominant view. And someday he may have a way of, getting his views more accepted. He's still, a lot of the scholars in China have to be careful. They're more accustomed to living in an authoritarian regime where they know what they can get away with and know what they can't get away with. And so they have found indirect ways of getting. One of my roles now is to try to say something that the Chinese liberals cannot say, but that some of them would like to say. And one of the things, for example, if I lectured to them and a Chinese reporter comes to me and I say, China should allow more different views to be spread, and they should have more freedom in expressing those views, it would not get published. But if I say, at Harvard University, we have found that we thrive on having different opinions, and we feel that our country does better, and our university is a better university because sometimes those people with different opinions turn out to be right, and it encourages us to do better. I can still say that in Chinese, and the Chinese will publish it. So my liberal friends in China want me to say that kind of stuff. So they have to live in a complicated environment of how much they can say and how much they can give stories that are comparable. And I've had to begin to learn some of that too, because I would like to have a voice in China, and I do. Still, I have quite a few Chinese. When I go to a Chinese gathering, a lot of people come up and say hello and say they've heard me in China and so forth. So I do have a voice, and I want to preserve that, and I want to find useful things to say that I can still say and get away with. So it's a complicated environment there, and I try the best I can to. And I asked some Chinese friends to help in advising me how to manage that. Yeah.
So I lied. That wasn't the last question. I have reserved that. And what you just said about learning to communicate in often less than ideal settings and finding your way through these tangles, leads into potentially my final question for you, and that is, there are current OWU undergraduates in this room. What advice would you give them in their next several years here?
I think they're going to have a hard time doing research the ideal way. I think 10, 15 years ago, it was possible to go to China and do a lot of field research. I doubt whether that's going to be possible in the next few years. You know, in the 1960s, when I was starting working on China, we couldn't even get in at all. And so we had to learn how much we could learn from the outside in Hong Kong. So we interviewed refugees and Chinese who had been abroad. We read documents and learned how to manage that. And so I think that they're going to have to be very flexible. China is going through a very tough period, and they won't have the full opportunity. I would say my advice would be, first of all, learn the languages really well, because I think the people who learn the language and are comfortable can get, on the average, a level of depth and understanding that's not possible. So you can get that in Taiwan. There's some intensive language programs in some places in China you can still go to get that. Nanjing still has a good program. There are some places, and so I would say if you can find a way to finance and get a really intensive immersion and get the language, and then sort of keep thinking of ways you could keep learning and adapting, I think you're going to have to be creative and take advantages of opportunities that are less than ideal. And I say don't give up, you know. From 1961, when I started working on China, until 71, we were completely closed. We do everything from the outside. And things are a lot better than that, but it's very complicated. And so my heart goes out to the people who are starting now, because there are not quite a few people who are already well trained. And it's true that some people in the FBI would like to hire FBI as people who haven't spent too much time in China, because if you spent time, you might be subject to influence. I think that's a terrible attitude, but that's reality. I mean, that's just the way it is. So you have to run the risks and sort of keep at it and don't give up. That's what I would say. Thank you very much.
That all sounds like wonderful advice across the board, not only for those studying Chinese history and culture. So thank you so much, Ezra. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.